The glove surfaced in the pale light of an October morning, the leather darkened by years of soil, the stitching softened like old memory. A cold wind moved through the trees that day, carrying the brittle smell of leaves breaking under their own weight. Sunlight slipped through the branches in thin, wavering lines, catching on a curve of leather that shouldn't have been there. Nothing else stirred in that clearing, no bird song, no insects, just the faint creak of an unfamiliar silence. The hunters who found it stood still for a long moment, the world holding its breath around them, as if waiting for someone to speak first. One of them brushed a hand across the air above it, not touching, only hovering, like he sensed a story he didn't yet want to know. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I remember that summer long before anything went wrong, when the days seemed to lie flat and endless across the Kansas prairie. I was still writing my weekly column, then the kind that mixed small-town news with a little local color church suppers, weather quirks, harvest reports. The gentle rhythm older readers always said felt like home. Most mornings I'd drive the county roads with my windows cracked, just enough to let in the smell of sun-warmed alfalfa and the faint sweetness from the grain elevator miles away. You could hear the cicadas starting up by mid-morning, their steady drone settling over everything like a second layer of heat. Back then, folks woke early, not out of necessity, so much as habit. Coffee at dawn, tractors humming to life not long after screen doors clapping shut behind men headed to barns that had outlasted generations. The Rowan place sat a few miles south of my own home, tucked between a stand of old cottonwoods and fields that rolled out in every direction. Earl and Margaret had been there as long as I could remember, two steady figures in a world that sometimes felt like it was changing a little too fast. Their land carried the look of long-held caretaking. The paint on the barn faded but sound, the porch steps worn smooth in the middle, the vegetable garden always weeded just so. Margaret kept her windows open whenever the weather allowed, letting the breeze carry in the sharp green scent of tomatoes and the soft drift of flour when she baked. Earl preferred the yard moving slowly these days, but with a kind of unspoken pride in every fence post he straightened. It was in that stillness, those late summer days, when the air hung heavy and the ground felt warm even before breakfast, that their grandson Caleb arrived. 12 years old, all limbs and laughter, carrying a baseball glove worn soft around the edges and a bat he treated with the reverence some boys reserve for pocket knives or first fishing rods. Linda, his mother, drove him down from Wichita every chance she got, saying he needed the fields and the fresh air, the kind you can't bottle and take back to the city no matter how tightly you try to hold on. She always stayed just long enough to drink a glass of her mother's sweet tea before heading back north, promising she'd return in a day or two. I'd see Caleb sometimes when I passed the property, his silhouette small against the corn as he practiced throwing a ball straight up into the sky, catching it with a soft thump only he could hear. On especially hot mornings, the dust on the road rose around him in faint wisps, catching sunlight the way old photographs catch time. He had that particular energy kids get when they're comfortable somewhere, running barefoot across the yard, kicking at stray pebbles, shouting greetings to whoever happened to be driving by. Earl would watch him from the shade near the barn, his hand resting on his hip, the lines around his eyes softening with something that looked a lot like contentment. There was nothing hurried in those days. Meals were slow affairs, the kind where you linger at the table even after the plates are cleared, just to listen to the wind move over the fields. After-dinner walks were almost a family ritual. Margaret would wipe her hands on a dish towel and say the same thing she always did. "Let's see what the evening looks like," and they'd stroll toward the western fence line while the sky turned the color of faded peaches. Sometimes I'd catch sight of them from the road, their figures spaced out at gentle intervals, moving without any rush at all. What stands out most now is how ordinary everything was. The dogs at neighboring farms barked at passing trucks. The radio played old country songs through afternoon static. Kids rode bicycles down gravel washboards in the late light, their laughter jumping across the ditches like stones. Even the storms behaved themselves that summer, sweeping in with a flash or two and rolling away before they had time to ruin anyone's plans. Nothing about that season carried the weight of warning. But there were small things, quiet, easily dismissed, that tug at me when I think back. A night when the wind died too suddenly, leaving the fields strangely still. A morning when I noticed Earl lingering on his porch longer than usual, staring toward the tree line as if trying to read something in the shadows. Or a moment when Margaret paused mid-sentence at the post office, distracted by something she couldn't quite name, then brushed it off with a polite smile. These were the sorts of details you only understand in hindsight, the kind that settle into memory long after you wish you'd paid closer attention. As August pushed on, the heat deepened into that late summer heaviness that makes the air thick enough to taste. Folks said it was one of the warmest years in a long while, the kind where ice water didn't stay cold for more than a few minutes, and the corn grew high enough to swallow your voice if you wandered too far. The county fair came and went. The church bulletin announced its third potluck of the month. Everything held that comfortable routine we'd come to trust. And yet, even in a place as familiar as ours, there was always a sense, a faint one hardly worth mentioning at the time, that the world can tilt without warning. The Rowans' porch light glowed a little longer one Friday evening, its soft yellow halo stretching across the yard in a way that seemed to wait for something. A phone rang once at my house just after dusk, then fell silent before I could reach it. On the far side of the fields, a dog barked in sharp bursts, then stopped as quickly as it had begun, leaving the night oddly hollow. None of it meant anything then. Not to us, not to anyone. But looking back, that quiet, that long, breath-held quiet, feels heavier now, as if the land itself sensed an absence before any of us understood what was missing. I remember the moment the calm shifted. It was late morning, and the heat was already drawing that thin shimmer off the gravel outside my house. I'd planned a quiet day of writing, maybe a drive later if the air settled. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual. But then the phone rang, one short ring, then silence. I didn't think much of it at first. Wrong number, I told myself. Or someone who'd changed their mind about calling. Still, the sound hung in the air with a strange weight, as if it had been cut off mid-thought. A little while later, when I stepped out to fetch the mail, I saw Earl Rowan's old truck rumbling past faster than he normally drove. The dust kicked up behind him in a pale cloud, catching the sun in a way that made the road look like it was glowing. He didn't wave. His eyes stayed fixed on the stretch ahead, and his shoulders were tight, his hands high on the wheel. Even from my porch, I could tell something wasn't right. Earl wasn't a man who rushed, not for anything. I watched the dust settle until the air went still again. The cicadas were already buzzing steady and unbroken, as though the world was trying to keep its rhythm. But that image of Earl driving too fast on a road he'd taken for decades wouldn't leave my mind. I went back inside, but the quiet in the house felt heavier than it had an hour earlier. It must have been just past 11 when my own phone rang again. This time it was Margaret, her voice thin and quivering at the edges. She asked if I'd happened to see their grandson Caleb, said he'd stepped out earlier to toss a baseball around near the lane and hadn't come back when she called him for breakfast. I told her the truth, I hadn't seen him that morning, but I tried to sound steady, reassuring. Kids wander, I said. They lose track of time. And it was true. I'd seen Caleb disappear behind the barn for 30 minutes just to watch a grasshopper hop across a fence board. But the silence on the other end of the line wasn't reassured by any of that. After we hung up, I drove down the road toward their place. The sky was a wide sheet of blue unbroken by any clouds, and the heat pressed through the truck's windows with a sticky weight. As I got closer to the Rowan farm, I could see Earl's truck parked crooked along the path that led toward the tree line. He was standing in the middle of the lane, staring down at something near his boots. When I pulled up, he didn't look over right away. The only sounds were the low hum of my engine and the dry rustle of the corn shifting in the wind. Then he stepped aside just enough for me to see a baseball and a wooden bat lying in the dust. No glove, no footprints except his own. The items looked strangely placed, not dropped in haste, not scattered after a fall. Just set there. I remember thinking how small the bat looked against the wide stretch of road. How still everything was around us. Earl rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a faint smear of dust above his brow. "He should have been back by now," he murmured. His voice cracked on the last word. It was the crack that told me this wasn't a simple case of a boy wandering too far. We walked the lane together, calling Caleb's name into the corn and the woods beyond. Each time our voices came back to us thinner than before, it sharpened the unease creeping up inside me. The air felt wrong, too, still too warm, the way it gets before a storm, except there wasn't a cloud to be found. I stopped at the bend in the road and listened. No laughter, no footsteps, just the faint buzz of grasshoppers and the distant groan of farm equipment miles away. There was no sign of movement at all, as if the entire stretch of land had been holding its breath. When we got back to the house, Margaret was on the porch, still wiping her hands on a dish towel, even though they were already clean. Her eyes kept darting to the path, expecting her grandson to appear at any second. She told us she'd called Linda and that she was already on her way from Wichita. The worry in her voice had become something sharper now. Panic rising through the veneer of calm she was trying so hard to hold. I watched her look toward the tree line again. The light caught the silver in her hair, and the breeze lifted a loose strand across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. "He always answers," she whispered. Then she shook her head hard, as if refusing the thought before it could settle. For the next hour, we combed the immediate area around the house. The porch, the barn, the back fields. I checked the shed and the old playhouse they'd kept from when Linda was a girl. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a sound. The longer we looked without finding him, the thicker the air felt. My throat grew dry. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. Time stretched in that strange way it does when fear quietly sharpens every detail. By the time Linda arrived, the sun was high overhead, beating down with a relentless brightness that made the shadows seem thin and fragile. She stepped out of her car before the engine even stopped calling her son's name, her voice breaking in places. She ran up the porch steps, hugged her mother with one arm, and asked Earl where he'd last seen the boy. He pointed down the lane, and she stared in that direction for a long moment, as if trying to will her child to appear. There's something about a parent's fear that changes the feel of the land around you. It settles low and deep, turning the familiar into something uncertain. Even the farm dogs, usually eager for company, stayed close to the porch, whining under their breath. Every sound, the squeak of the screen door, the clatter of a metal bucket shifting in the barn, the creak of the wind in the corn, felt too loud, too sharp. We retraced Caleb's likely path again and again, each time hoping we'd overlooked something. A scuffed footprint, a stray thread from a shirt, anything. But the road held only dust and heat. The only marks were the faint patterns left by Earl's boots and my own. There was no trail to follow, no direction to move in. At one point, Linda walked ahead of us toward the bend, her pace quickening with every step. I could see her shoulders rise and fall rapidly as she tried to swallow whatever fear was climbing up through her chest. She stopped where the road curved and put her hands on her knees, staring into the tall rows of corn as if she could part them with her gaze alone. The air was thick with the smell of baked earth and the faint sweetness of corn tassels. She didn't move until Earl reached her and put a steady hand on her back. The hours that followed took on a strange, drifting quality. We searched the same places repeatedly, the sun sliding slowly westward, as if mocking our efforts. Each pass left us more desperate than the last. I kept thinking I'd hear a rustle, a shout, the telltale crack of twigs underfoot. but there was only the heat, only the broad, indifferent quiet of the fields. The first real chill came when Margaret stepped out of the kitchen again and looked at the horizon. The sunlight was still bright, but the shadows had shifted just enough to show that the day was moving faster than we wanted it to. She held her hand over her heart like she was steadying it. "We need help," she said. That was the moment denial slipped away, the moment when the uneasy hush around the farm turned into something sharp and undeniable. Linda nodded, her jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. Earl stared down at the lane as though it might offer him an answer if he looked long enough. I made the call. My voice sounded oddly distant in my own ears, flat and steady despite the tremor running through me. I gave the dispatcher the address, the age, the last known direction, each word tasting heavier than the last. When I hung up, the porch felt oppressively quiet. Even the wind had stopped. A slow dusk began settling across the fields, the light turning softer, almost gentle in contrast to the tension knotting our shoulders. You could hear crickets starting up their evening chorus, replacing the cicadas. The temperature dipped just enough to let the dry smell of autumn leaves drift through the yard. None of us spoke. Then, just as the last of the sun slipped behind the far tree line, a distant hum grew on the road. Headlights crested the hill, yellow and muted against the gathering twilight. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, the gravel crunching under its tires in a steady rhythm that seemed far too calm for the storm growing inside us. When the sheriff's cruiser finally pulled into the driveway, the engine clicked softly as it cooled, and the deputy inside took a long moment before stepping out. He removed his hat as he approached, and in the fading light, his expression said everything we hadn't wanted to admit. The night around us deepened, and the silence settled heavier still. When the sheriff's office fully took over, the tone on the Rowan property changed in a way you could feel through the ground. The evening before had been frantic voices calling into empty fields, the air hot and uneasy. But the next morning, long before the sun fully rose, county cruisers lined the gravel lane in a neat, purposeful row. Their light bars flickered against the cottonwoods with a muted glow painting the farm in soft pulses of red and blue that faded into the pale dawn. You could smell diesel from the generators the deputies brought in, mingling with the damp scent of soil still holding the night's coolness. One deputy unfolded a portable table beside the barn, spreading paperwork across it, while another set down a radio box that crackled as soon as he flicked it on. That was the moment it sank in for me. This was no longer just a family searching. It had become something larger, heavier, something with protocols and sectors and codes. I remember Margaret standing near the porch, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Her eyes tracked every movement from the officers, though she didn't speak. Linda was pacing small circles near the steps, her hair pulled back in a way that showed she'd slept little, if at all. The faint light caught the tremble in her hands each time she brushed at invisible dust on her jeans. The air held a tension that didn't come from noise, but from its absence. The quiet around the farm felt strange, almost reverent, like the land itself understood why everyone was gathering. Not long after sunrise, a search and rescue truck rumbled onto the property carrying volunteers and 2 handlers with working dogs. The back hatch opened with a metallic clank, and the dogs stepped out, noses immediately to the ground, tails stiff and alert. One handler crouched down and breathed steadily against the animal's ear, whispering instructions I couldn't hear. The dog's harness straps creaked softly as they pulled forward, eager, purposeful. Seeing them stirred something in my chest, a flicker of hope tempered already by the fear of what they might find. The sheriff unfurled a large laminated map on the hood of his truck. I stood a few feet away, close enough to catch the smell of the dry erase marker he uncapped. He mapped out the land in wide, practiced strokes, the fields, the narrow tree belt, the river bends, the hunting trails locals used when the season rolled around. Volunteers leaned in hands on their hips, their boots leaving faint impressions in the dust. The early sun cast long, stretched-out shadows of all of us across the ground, as though we'd grown taller overnight. When the dogs were given one of Caleb's shirts, they started with the same focus I'd seen in them during earlier cases over the years, noses low, breathing, sharp movements, precise. Their handlers held the leads firm, but not tight, giving them room to work. I followed a few yards behind, feeling the cool morning air cling to my skin. Dew glinted on the edges of tall weeds along the lane. For a moment, the only sounds were the dogs' sniffs, the soft crunch of boots, and the occasional radio squawk from the team nearest the house. For the first stretch of their search, the dogs pulled steadily toward the lane where Earl had found the bat and baseball. They circled that spot in slow, deliberate loops, their noses tracing invisible patterns across the dust. One of them let out a short, high whine, not a discovery, but a sign of confusion. The handlers exchanged a brief look, something tight and uneasy, and encouraged the dogs to move onward. From there, the search widened. Volunteers formed a line spaced out so that each person could see the next. We walked toward the tree line, pushing aside tall grass and saplings. The ground felt uneven beneath my boots, soft patches of earth. Sudden dips, dried roots ready to trip the unwary. Birds rustled through the branches, their wings sending down small showers of leaves. As we pressed deeper into the wooded strip, the temperature dropped noticeably. The shade was welcome, but it came with a different sort of stillness, the kind that makes you aware of every breath you take. We reached the small footbridge that crossed a narrow stretch of water. Here, the dogs hesitated again. Their bodies were taut, their snouts rising to catch scents the rest of us couldn't detect. Then, as if confused all at once, they circled the middle of the bridge, sniffing the board's tails low. A handler crouched, placing his palm against the old wood. It creaked under the added pressure. I leaned on the railing and listened to the gentle ripple of the muddy water below, carrying the faint smell of algae and wet earth. Nothing about the bridge looked disturbed. No fresh scuffs, no pieces of clothing caught on the posts. Just the old boards weathered and warped by years of Kansas sun. The dogs whined again this time with a frustrated pitch. And then they simply lost whatever thread they'd been following. Their noses lifted, swinging left, then right, searching for something they could no longer find. The handlers signaled the sheriff, and he marked the area on his map with a quick, hard stroke of his marker. A small knot of dread seemed to settle into everyone's shoulders. We pushed into the fields next the corn, reaching well above our heads. Moving through rows that tall felt like entering a tunnel without walls, the sunlight only managing to pierce through in thin, vertical slices. The dry rustle of the stalks brushed against our arms and legs, leaving faint scratches. Radios crackled overhead, faint and muddied by distance. Every once in a while, a voice would call out that a section was clear, the soft static afterward lingering like a sigh. In all that searching the land gave us nothing. Not a shoe print, not a torn thread, not a single overturned stone or snapped twig that pointed definitively in any direction. For a boy who loved to run to explore, to push through weeds and brush without a second thought, the absence of any trace felt wrong, unnatural. By midday, helicopters from the county and a nearby city joined the effort. Their blades chopped through the thick summer air, sending down gusts that stirred dust off the gravel and flattened patches of grass. From the porch, you could see the shadows of the aircraft slide slowly over the fields as if sweeping a great dark hand across the land. The distant thrum of the engines vibrated through the ground underfoot, low and steady like a heartbeat trying to match the growing tension on the farm. Despite all this, every area checked came back with the same word clear. Back at the command table, the sheriff's deputies updated the map again, marking each completed section with a careful line. Their faces were drawn, their voices low. I stood near the edge of the group, listening. One deputy pointed at a ravine north of the property and mentioned a report about a truck someone thought they'd seen at dawn. Another spoke about hunters moving through the woods too early in the season. A third mentioned the seasonal workers camped near the highway. None of it fit, and yet none of it could be dismissed. By late afternoon, word had spread through the nearest towns. Folks started showing up, neighbors, friends, even strangers with sturdy boots and farm equipment. Some brought coolers filled with ice and bottled water. Others arrived with ATVs ready to cover the rougher terrain. The sound of engines hummed across the fields. Car doors slammed. People gathered in clusters, speaking in low tones that flickered with worry. It's strange how quickly speculation fills a vacuum. While volunteers checked creek banks and brush thickets, whispers drifted through the crowd. Some said they'd heard a gunshot earlier that morning. Others swore there'd been a truck parked out on the West Road, engine running with no one nearby. An older man mentioned fishermen who came in from a neighboring town most weekends. A woman claimed she'd seen someone walking near the far fence line days before someone she didn't recognize. Rumors never stay in one place. They grow legs. They cross fields faster than people can. The sheriff tried to keep things grounded, but even the deputies couldn't completely hide their unease. More than once I caught them exchanging glances when a new detail came in looks that said they didn't know what to make of any of it. As the search stretched into its second evening, exhaustion settled across the farm like another layer of heat. The sun dipped low, turning the sky a dusty orange. Volunteers returned in small groups, shoulders slumped, boots caked with dirt, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Dogs were loaded back into crates. Radios were clipped onto belts for recharging. Conversations were brief, quiet, subdued. The Rowan family stayed on the porch most of that time, watching every vehicle that came and went. Linda rarely spoke. When she did, her voice carried the flatness of someone who'd run out of words long before running out of fear. Margaret kept tucking her hands into the pockets of her apron, then pulling them out again as if she didn't know what to do with them. Earl stood with his arms folded and his gaze locked on the path leading toward the woods, as though he could force it to give up its secrets just by staring hard enough. I felt the weight of it, too, the silence that returned each time a team reported back with nothing. The cadence of the day had slowed to a crawl shaped by long stretches of waiting between bursts of activity. Even my breath felt heavier, like the air had thickened into something you had to push through. As night returned for the second time, lanterns and portable lights cast pale circles across the yard. They attracted moths that fluttered in soft, frantic patterns. The temperature had dropped, carrying the sharp scent of cooling earth and distant cut hay. Somewhere in the fields, an engine coughed and sputtered as someone tried one last sweep before calling it for the night. I stood by the sheriff's table as he reviewed the map once more. His eyes traced the marked sections, the cleared areas, the narrow pockets still unsearched. The wind shifted, lifting the corner of the map slightly, making the plastic laminate crackle. A deputy stepped up beside him, holding a clipboard and lowering his voice. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, cautious, deliberate, carrying a note of concern. Then, just as I turned toward the porch, another deputy approached the command center with something small, cupped carefully in his hand. His expression was taut, unreadable in the dim light. The sheriff straightened and the murmurs around the table quieted. No one said a word, but the look on the deputy's face told me the search had just changed direction. A line had been crossed between uncertainty and something darker, and though none of us knew it yet, the next steps would pull us even deeper into a story the land had been holding in silence for far too long. It happened the way these things often do, with a single voice cutting through a long stretch of quiet. We'd been out there for hours working through the last pockets of timberland the sheriff had marked as priorities. The afternoon light was thin, almost metallic, slipping between branches that rattled in the rising wind. Dust clung to the cuffs of everyone's jeans, and the air carried that dry late-season bite that tells you fall isn't far off. Folks were tired, moving slower, their boots dragging just a little. Then a deputy's shout rose from somewhere ahead of us, sharp enough to freeze every sound in the woods. His radio sputtered a burst of static a second later, followed by a few clipped words none of us could quite catch. I felt my stomach drop before I even turned in the direction of the noise. The search line broke apart as people moved toward him, weaving through scrub and saplings. The leaves underfoot were brittle, snapping with every step, echoing more loudly than seemed natural. I walked toward the cluster forming up ahead, the light shifting through the branches, making the whole scene flicker between brightness and shadow. By the time I reached the outer edge of the group, a deputy was rolling out yellow tape with quick, practiced motions. His jaw was tight and his eyes didn't lift from what he was doing. That alone told me this wasn't some false alarm. Inside the taped-off circle, the forest floor dipped slightly, just enough for rainwater to have washed away parts of the topsoil. The ground was dark and soft, the smell of damp earth rising like a low exhale. A few roots from a large maple tree jutted up through the dirt, twisted and pale. One of them had pushed something upward, just barely breaking the surface. At first, it looked like nothing more than a piece of old leather trapped beneath the bark, weathered to the same muted color as the soil. But as an investigator knelt down with a small brush, the truth revealed itself bit by bit. It was a glove. A child's baseball glove, its leather warped by years underground, the stitching faint but still visible. Soil clung to it like a second skin. A thin twig had worked itself through two of the finger slots, holding them apart in a way that made the whole thing look eerily lifelike, as though a hand might still be inside. The air around us tightened. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. Someone stepped aside to give me a clearer view, and for a moment I felt the world tilt just slightly, as if the ground had shifted beneath my boots. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. I knew what that glove meant before anyone had to say a word. We all did. The feeling hit me with a kind of soft violence, not loud, not dramatic, just final. A slow collapse from the inside out. The lead investigator signaled for the rest of us to step back. His movements were careful, deliberate, each gesture measured like someone handling something fragile. He asked for paper bags, for brushes, for gloves. Another deputy moved through the brush, carrying tools in both hands, his boots making shallow impressions in the damp soil. The cold breeze stirred leaves across the roots, whispering around the edges of the clearing. Everything felt suddenly smaller, more contained, like the woods were folding in around that spot. When the glove was lifted, not by pulling, but by brushing and scooping the soil away in slow layers, I saw the faint outline of letters beneath the grime. Not fully formed, just enough to recognize the curve of handwriting made years earlier by a child proud of his own belongings. Even half erased by time, that small detail hollowed out the center of my chest. I steadied myself against a nearby tree, pressing my palm to the rough bark until the sting grounded me. The glove was placed inside a clean evidence bag. Soil samples went into others. A deputy took photographs, the shutter clicking rhythmically in the still air. Each sound felt too loud, too sharp. I could see Linda standing farther back, arms wrapped tightly around her torso. Her eyes locked on the investigator's hands. She wasn't crying. She looked like someone holding herself together by sheer will, her breath trembling each time she exhaled. Earl stood stone still beside her, his hat in his hands, the wind lifting wisps of his graying hair. I couldn't read his expression. It was something beyond grief, beyond shock, a weariness that went straight to the bone. Forensics arrived soon after. They moved with a solemn efficiency, marking the perimeter, photographing every inch of disturbed earth. The late afternoon sun slanted through the branches, catching dust in the air and turning it into a pale haze. I watched them work, each motion steady and respectful, as though they were handling something sacred. The longer they stayed, the clearer the picture became. The glove hadn't been dropped recently. It hadn't been placed there by chance. It had been in the ground for years, buried deep enough that only the slow push of roots and rain had brought it back toward the surface. Nearby, beneath a patch of leaf litter, investigators uncovered hints of an old fire, fragments of charred wood and rusted tin, all settled into the earth with age. Farther out, they found a length of thin synthetic rope frayed at the ends and tangled in brush. Each piece was bagged, labeled, and carried carefully back toward the vehicles. When the detectives stepped aside to speak with the sheriff, the wind shifted again, stirring the top layer of leaves across the cleared area. Their voices were hushed, almost swallowed by the woods, but the gravity in their posture was unmistakable. The glove wasn't just a lost item, it was a link, a doorway into whatever had happened in that forest all those years earlier. Over the next hours, as daylight dropped away and the woods cooled into evening, more pieces began to fall into place. The forensics team studied the stitching, the wear patterns, the discoloration. They photographed the partial name still visible inside. Later I learned that microscopic traces from the lining confirmed something we already understood in our hearts. The glove belonged to Caleb. That truth settled over the farm like a cold, unmovable weight. It wasn't just the glove, though. The location mattered. The campsite remnants mattered. The rope mattered. Each detail hinted at presence, someone staying there long enough to build a fire, long enough to leave behind losses and evidence. And each detail carried the same sickening implication: Caleb hadn't vanished into thin air. Someone had taken him, someone who knew the forest better than most folks in our county ever would. Not long after, the investigative focus shifted. Fresh detectives arrived from larger jurisdictions. They asked for old maps, older reports, names of anyone who'd held hunting permits in that corridor over the years. The glove had cracked the case open, exposing what had been buried literally and figuratively beneath 6 years of uncertainty. A picture began forming of a man who understood the land, who knew how to move without leaving traces, who had lived among us without drawing attention. A man who blended into the background so seamlessly you'd never look twice. The night the truth finally surfaced, I stood by the sheriff's truck as he read through the lab reports. His face tightened as he flipped each page. The evidence from the forest pointed in one direction: an old electronics man who lived on the edge of town, a man who'd worked for the cooperative for decades, someone with access to communication equipment and county infrastructure. Someone who'd used his skills to mislead the search effort back then, to mask noise, to shift suspicion. The more the investigators laid out, the more horrifying the pattern became. Items recovered from his workshop, later scraps of children's belongings, photographs taken from a distance. Radio gear tuned to emergency channels confirmed the worst. It was systematic, patient, carried out by someone who had walked the same roads we did, stood in the same stores, nodded politely at neighbors. Someone who had pretended to be invisible and for years had succeeded. That night stretched on endlessly. Floodlights were brought into the clearing. Deputies moved with measured steps, their shadows long and wavering against the ground. The air grew colder, carrying the smell of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. Linda remained on the porch, refusing every suggestion to rest. Her gaze stayed fixed on the tree line, lit faintly by the glow of the investigators' lamps. Earl stayed beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, his thumb moving in slow, absent circles. By the time the last evidence bags were sealed and loaded into vehicles, the moon had risen high above the fields, casting a pale sheen across the farm. The sheriff called for everyone to gather near the barn. His voice was steady but softer than usual, carrying the weight of what he had to say. The glove had been confirmed. The campsite was legitimate. The rope was likely connected. And the primary suspect, a man the town barely noticed, was already being brought in for questioning. I felt a heaviness settle into me, then a mixture of sorrow and grim understanding. The mystery that had haunted the fields for so long was no longer a mystery. It was a story with a face, a chain of choices, a trail that had finally been uncovered inch by inch. As the sheriff wrapped up, a deputy stepped out of the darkness with a stack of files tucked under his arm. "We'll need statements first thing in the morning," he murmured. His voice carried that weary tremor you hear in people who've been awake too long, who've seen too much in one day. Officers began packing equipment radios, buzzing softly in the background. The night air felt colder as I walked back toward my truck. Gravel shifted beneath my boots, each step sounding louder than usual. Behind me, the farmhouse porch light glowed dimly, illuminating the silhouettes of a family bowed beneath the truth they'd carried too long without knowing. Ahead, the sheriff's office loomed in my mind, the long hours waiting, the interviews, the press calls, the paperwork that would follow. I opened my truck door, paused with my hand on the frame, and let out a slow breath. The case had cracked open at last, and nothing about the county would ever be the same. The long night was only beginning. In the hours that followed the discovery, the woods around the Rowan farm filled with a somber sort of activity, the kind that moves slowly because everyone knows the weight of what they're handling. Deputies came and went along the dirt lane, their tires pressing fresh tracks into the soft ground. Floodlights cast long beams through the branches, giving the trees a pale, watchful glow. I stood back from most of it, my hands tucked into my jacket pockets, trying to make sense of the cold knot sitting heavy in my chest. Even then, even with the glove bagged and transported, it felt unreal, not in disbelief exactly, but in that way tragedy sometimes lands gently at first, as if giving you a moment before it lays itself down fully. The Rowan family stayed close to the house. Linda had drifted to the porch steps, sitting heavily with her elbows on her knees. She kept her gaze on the field as if she expected something to rise up from it. Margaret stayed behind her, resting a hand lightly on her daughter's back, her thumb tracing small circles whenever she felt a tremor. Earl stood a little apart, one foot on the first step, one on the ground, hat in hand. The yellow lights from the cruisers painted his face in alternating stripes of brightness and shadow, and he looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in an afternoon. Word spread quickly through Harper County. People drove up slowly in their pickups, stepping out with careful, subdued gestures, hats off, voices soft. The discovery hit the whole community like a long-held breath, releasing at last, but not in relief, more like resignation. Folks lingered on the gravel drive, their bodies angled toward the forest, listening to the distant voices of investigators. Someone brought a thermos of coffee. Someone else placed a blanket around Linda's shoulders. Every action was quiet, tender, as though the night itself might crack apart if met with anything louder. By the next morning, the name of the man taken in for questioning the retired electrician who lived on the town's fringe spread through church foyers, diners, and farm stores. I heard it whispered first by the deputies who'd spent the whole night filling out reports under buzzing fluorescent lights. Then it echoed through the hardware store when I stopped in for a few supplies. Nobody had a hard time picturing his face. He was the kind of man who blended into the background until someone pointed him out. The polite nodder, the fellow who fixed wiring and kept to himself. Too quiet, some said. Harmless, others insisted. But once his workshop was searched, those opinions changed quickly. Evidence came out in layers much like the soil that had covered the glove for years. Boxes filled with old children's belongings. Radio equipment tuned to police frequencies. Photographs taken from a distance of places and faces that should never have been observed like that. It painted a picture nobody in our county wanted to see, but one they couldn't turn away from. The sheriff spoke about the findings with a voice that stayed steady, even though the muscles around his mouth tightened with every sentence. He was a man who'd served long enough to know that some truths come with a cost. When charges were filed, the courthouse that usually felt sleepy and half-empty filled every morning with people sitting in the back rows, hands folded tight in their laps. The air inside carried that stiff, dry smell of old paperwork and polished benches. The prosecutor laid out pieces of the case with a quiet determination, threading together the forensic evidence from the glove, the items found in the suspect's shed, and years of unexplained disappearances in the surrounding region. I sat through most of those proceedings, taking notes I never published because they felt too heavy to put into print. The Rowan family came to court when they needed to, but never more than that. Linda often wore a dark sweater, no matter how warm the day was, as if she were protecting herself from something the rest of us couldn't see. Margaret sat beside her, hands clasped in her lap, the light catching the thin silver band she twirled whenever the testimony became too difficult to hear. Earl kept his hat in his lap, handling it with the same care you'd give to something that had belonged to a loved one. Their presence was its own quiet act of courage. When the conviction finally came, it didn't bring closure the way television dramas like to suggest. It brought a stillness, a pause, a recognition that the story had reached its formal end, but the ache of the loss would continue in its own time. The man responsible would never walk free again. That much was certain. But even with justice delivered, there was a hollow space left behind the kind, carved out by years of hoping for answers that arrive only when hope has worn thin. The town changed in subtle ways after that. Parents who once let their children wander the edges of fields during the summer kept them closer. Folks paid more attention to unfamiliar vehicles on back roads. Even the forest belt near the Rowan farm seemed to shift in temperament. Not in any physical sense, but in the way people spoke about it, the way they hesitated a moment longer before stepping into its shade. What once was just another part of rural life took on a shadowed reputation, one shaped not by superstition, but by memory. As for the Rowan family, they rebuilt what they could. Time didn't erase their loss, but it softened the edges enough for them to keep moving. Linda stayed on the farm, finding comfort in the routines she'd once taken for granted, feeding the horses in early morning light, tending the garden with her mother, walking the fence line at dusk. Sometimes I'd see her pause at the edge of the woods, lifting her face to the breeze, as though listening for something only she could hear. She carried herself differently after the trial, quieter, but also steadier, as if grief had settled into a permanent place within her, no longer overwhelming her, but shaping the woman she had become. Earl kept putting a baseball on the porch rail each August. It was a ritual he never spoke about. He simply placed the ball there at sunrise, dusted it off if a storm rolled through, and brought it inside only when the cold arrived. Some folks thought it was a way of honoring Caleb. Others believed it helped him hold on to the good memories, the ones not touched by the darkness that followed. I think it was his way of speaking aloud, without using words, a grandfather's quiet devotion carved into the rhythm of each passing year. I've carried the whole experience with me in ways I didn't expect, not with fear, but with a kind of sober awareness. Whenever I drive past the old maple grove where the glove was found, I slow down just a touch. The wind through that stretch of trees always sounds a little different, softer, as if carrying an echo of all that was uncovered there. Sometimes in the evenings, when the light grows thin and the horizon starts to blur, I think about how easily a place can hold secrets, how long the truth can wait before rising to the surface. What stays with me most isn't the glove or the evidence, or even the trial. It's the image of Linda on the porch that night, wrapped in a blanket watching the forest with a stillness that broke something in me. It's the memory of Earl's hands shaking slightly as he held his hat standing at the edge of the clearing. And it's the feeling that settled over the town, a blend of sorrow, relief, and the quiet realization that evil can move unnoticed in familiar places. I tell these stories because they linger, because remembering them is the closest we come to honoring the people who lived through them, and because in the end, the only thing stronger than the shadows cast by tragedy is the light we keep shining on the truth. There's an evening wind that sweeps across the Rowan farm every fall, bending the tall grass in slow waves. I still see that motion when I think of Caleb, gentle, steady, moving forward, even after everything has changed. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.